Good evening, everyone. Hello. My name is Jenny Hall, and I'm the Assistant Director of Education at the New Museum. Today, I join you from the unceded land of the Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to the Lenape people, elders, and ancestors, past, present, and future. On behalf of the New Museum, I am glad to welcome you to tonight's conversation in conjunction with the exhibition Theaster Gates, Young Lords and Their Traces. This conversation will discuss Theaster Gates' interdisciplinary practice, and we're excited here to have in conversation Jessica Bell Brown, Dieter Roelstraete, and Hamza Walker, moderated by exhibition co-curator, Kraus Family Senior Curator Gary Carrion-Murayari. I would like to thank education and public engagement staff members, Austin D. Bose and Derek Wright, as well as the entire New Museum team for their help bringing this program together. Before we begin, I will share with you some brief introductions on our speakers. Jessica Bell Brown is the Curator and Department Head for Contemporary Art at the Baltimore Museum of Art. Prior to the BMA, she was a consultant curator at Gracie Mansion Conservancy in New York, where she curated She Persists, A Century of Women Artists in New York, 1919 to 2019, with First Lady Shirlane McCrae. Previously, she held roles at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and Creative Time. Her writing has been featured in several artist monographs and catalogs, as well as Flash Art, Art Forum, Art Papers, Hyperallergic, and the Brooklyn Rail. Dieter Roelstraete is the curator of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society at the University of Chicago. Recent exhibitions in Chicago and abroad, which include solo presentations by Ida Appelbrug, Arnold J. Kemp, Pope L., Martha Rossler, and Cecilia Vincunha. Hamza Walker serves as director of LAXART, a nonprofit art space in Los Angeles. Recent exhibitions he has curated at LAXART include Nikita Gale, Candace Williams, Cassandra Press, and Post Commodities, some reach while others clap. Prior to joining LAXART in 2016, he was Director of Education and Associate Curator at the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago. Programs like this are core to the New Museum's work of advancing new art and new ideas. New Museum public programs are generously supported by the Bowery Council, and we also like to thank members and supporters like you who helped to make these programs possible. Without further ado, I will pass this on to Gary.
Thank you, Ginny, and thank you all for joining us here tonight. This is the last public program for Theaster Gates, Young Lords and Their Traces, an exhibition that we're very proud to put on here at the New Museum. I also want to thank my colleagues, Massimiliano Gioni and Madeline Weisberg, who also organized the show. And I also want to thank Jessica, Hamza, and Dieter for joining us here tonight. All three are, as you know, quite brilliant curators, but each of them have a really kind of sustained dialogue with Theaster over many years. They're also close friends of Theaster's too. So I think as much as possible, I'm going to defer to them tonight so they can provide some insight and some maybe some anecdotes and maybe kind of really get into what makes this exhibition so special and what makes Theaster a really quite unique artist, which hopefully this is quite apparent to you through seeing the show. So we'll start with some questions for each of you, but of course, we'll see where the conversation takes us. Maybe I'll start with Dieter, who, because you were based in Chicago, maybe had the most, let's say, proximal relationship to the objects that are actually in the exhibition. And one thing we're quite hoping to do with this exhibition is to show how an amazing an object maker Theaster is, how complicated his use of objects is, like how he's able to both kind of speak through objects and let objects speak in different ways. So if maybe you could talk a little bit about the second floor of the exhibition, how you view the kind of different positions that Theaster takes up in relationship to objects in his work.
Yes, I will try to do that. And thanks, of course, for inviting me to be on this panel. Very nice to be in the presence of my colleagues here. It is true. And I actually want to start with a personal response to the exhibition and a personal reflection on the exhibition as a whole, which will eventually, I think, meander towards answering your question or addressing the assignment. So I moved to Chicago in 2012, February 2012. Among the first people I bumped into, quite by accident, I think, in Chicago would have been Hamza Walker, I think. I mean, would have been like the second or the third person I met. And Theaster as well, actually. I've met him very early on in my time in Chicago. I moved there to take on a position at the MCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art, as a senior curator. And so I've known Theaster for a long time. He's a friend, he's a colleague. He is also quite literally a neighbor. We live across the street from each other in the South Side, which is of course so incredibly present in his work throughout the exhibition and throughout his entire trajectory, really. And so I know the work well. I have written about it in the past extensively. I've been in conversation with him before. I have written for the catalog of this exhibition. The title of the essay is The Reminder, a reference in a way to one of kind of the central functions of much of his work, which is to reminisce and memorialize and remember, which of course is one of the the central thrusts also of this exhibition, right? Which is very kind of elegiac in its tenor. So, and I'm not here to brag about the profundity of my personal relationship with Theaster, who's listening along, right? There you are, Theaster. I know you're in France. Actually at work, I hope, on a project for an exhibition that I'm curating later on this year. So do not dwell too long on this. So from this perspective, of course, one can get jaded, right, about one's knowledge of an artist's work. If you've known an artist for 10 years, 20 years, 25 years, you can take it for granted. You go see the shows out of a sense of familial duty almost, right? Out of a sense of curiosity and interest. And you sometimes very quickly consume the exhibition, and of course you agree that it's all great and all that. But I have to say that this exhibition actually, as I started on the fourth floor, down to the third, and then ending on the second, actually felt it to be one of the most moving exhibitions that I've seen of his work for sure, but actually also in recent memory. And this is no idle boast. I'm not here to butter anyone up, but really, it's a very emotionally charged show, and which I think is interesting with regard to his work, because there is a lot of humor in what Theaster does. There's elements of parody. You start on the fourth floor. The first thing you get really is the Black Monks and Theaster's take on gospel, which always has a strong tongue-in-cheek element. And I'm sure that perhaps Hamza will address this as well when he's asked to talk about the fourth floor. But there's also there's kind of like an ironic there's always kind of like an ironic charge in the work, which enriches it. But also kind of complicates a little bit how, as a viewer, you invest in it emotionally. And this felt, for a variety of personal reasons, having to do with the passing of friends and family in Theaster's own world. But there was something really quite direct, I felt, about the emotional address of this exhibition. And congratulations on putting it together in this way with Theaster, of course. So, and I've already mentioned the fact that the elegy, the notion of elegy, seems to be kind of like a central sentimental charge in the exhibition. And so many of the objects shown in vitrines have this somewhat morbid cast. It's also perhaps the most morbid show that I've seen of Theaster's, because death is what it is about. It's about the death of Oki Weser, alluded to in the ascots, right? The wall piece, the double wall piece with the ascots. The death of Robert Byrd, a scholar at the University of Chicago who was a colleague of Theaster's, a friend of Theaster's, a colleague of mine and a friend of mine, a scholar of Russian literature whose library is on view on the second floor. Theaster invited Robert's widow, Christina, to write a letter really on behalf of Robert, kind of explaining the presence of the library in the show, which, of course, is a very moving document. Sam Gilliam's boot, right, which kind of comes charged really with the energy almost of a what do you call it again, a religious object that has a relic, right? A relic, Bell's bell, the tiny little bell in one of the vitrines that belonged to Bell Hooks, who died about a year, I think, before the show opened. Someone that Theaster also knew quite well, and it's actually quite funny. Just yesterday, the reason why I had to fly in to New York today and kind of came rushing a little bit from the airport is that yesterday evening I had a event of my own at the University of Chicago, the Neubauer Collegium Gallery, which I run, and the event in question revolved around Rick Lowe, the Houston-based artist and pioneer of social practice, who of course is a very important person in Theaster's life, and someone that Theaster will very generously acknowledge as a mentor. And it was Theaster also who told me that actually I believe it was Rick who introduced Theaster to Bell Hooks. Theaster kind of left Bell's home with the little bell, as a memento in a way, when he was first introduced to Bell Hooks through Rick Lowe. It's a nice kind of little triangle in a way of social practice histories in a way, stretching all the way from Houston through the Midwest to Chicago. So that's, and I've kind of already dropped a couple of notions, the idea of the relic, the elegy. So there's kind of, there's always an animistic dimension to a lot of what he does, which is of course very strongly present in the ceramic work and kind of sculptural variations on that. And kind of thinking back of the, calling it a morbid show is obviously not well, it's not an insult. Obviously, it's a compliment, right? I mean, for an old death metal head like myself, but the intensity of the light on the third floor in particular, right? Like that ceramic space is so is gloomy, and we, those of us who've paid attention to the label and have read through the materials accompanying the exhibition, of course, know that this exhibition was also conceived in the wake of the passing of Theaster's father, who, a man of many trades and many talents, but the most important trade for Theaster personally, as his development as an artist, was of course that Theaster Senior was a roofer, and the presence of roofing materials throughout the exhibition, but also throughout his practice as a whole, is this kind of enduring homage to a father figure with whom he of course had to inevitably also have a complicated relationship, like we all do. And I'm saying this because my dad is an artist, and he's not listening, so that's fine. So yeah, I'm not sure if that says anything about objects really, but I've kind of I touched on a couple of things that perhaps.
But I think you kind of get at I think what's been a big success, and maybe I think a big surprise for people in New York who, I think know Theaster more by reputation than by actual experience, of his objects and his exhibitions, is, the amount of emotion that comes through. But I think it's a quite sophisticated choreography of how he deploys those emotions and those relationships on the second floor. I think maybe all of us can maybe speak about collections, and we're a non-collecting institution, and I think that's always interesting for us to play around with those ideas. But I think Theaster is quite conscious of the morbidity of collections and collecting. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I think sure Hamza, you've probably been there since the beginning of Theaster bringing in some of these collections. Like you could talk about, and maybe I don't know if you have any stories about how he's opened up to that. But also I think it's quite surprising. I think when you read about something like the Johnson Archive, it from outside it seems quite academic and and maybe even like, removed. But once when you see something like Robert's Bird Library, or even the way he's treating those test prints from the collection in the vitrines, it's something quite different. How do you feel about, our collection of the collections, maybe?
Right. I for quite some time took exception to the term archives when referring to those things that Theaster gathered. He's a hoarder. He'll be the first to admit he's a hoarder. And I was there to ask him at various turns, say, man, what are you going to do with all these records? It's like, man, but so they weren't archives. That was not the impulse. The more important impulse for him, no, there are archives at this point. Right. Things that do qualify, I would say, as archives within his collection of collections. The Johnson publications, the Ed Williams archive, thank you. Just by virtue of volume, I would say. And then within that, you can see the kind of, I refer to that stuff as negrobilia. But within that, there are different, you could categorize those objects, you could classify them in various ways. Sheet music, but the impulse was he wanted things that people didn't want anymore. So the Dr. Wax records going out of business. He said, look, I'll buy everything that you have. Call me on your last day. Call me after all of your bins have been raided, and I'll take the dregs. And that's a strange thing, right? He didn't care what was in it. He was just like, and he would persist. He's like, no, there's stuff of value in there. So it wasn't this, attempt at archiving. I think that was much more the kind of impulse. He did the same thing with the Prairie Avenue books in Chicago. That was one of the great architecture bookstores in the United States. And the owner, his kids didn't want the business. And he said the same thing to him. He said, call me on your last day when all is said and done, and I'll take the remainder of those things. So those were two of the early, and then the slides. The same thing. Universities wants to throw the glass lantern slides. And Theaster said, no. I want to. So, and that's very interesting. That's more interesting to me, some kind of impulse or completest sense of what an archive does, than somebody declaring that there's value in what is being discarded, right, after people have gone through. And then that then branched off, I would say, into things that do have a memorial cast to them. Mm-hmm. So Robert Byrd's library, the Frankie Knuckles collection. Then the Johnson Library, which was, and it's not just the Johnson Library. Well, yes, there's the Johnson Library, yeah. It all falls into the Johnson Library, but there's all different components to it that he may have acquired in different stages, let's say. So that was the and I guess just by its sheer volume, either individual collections or the collection of collections, the volume of stuff, I guess one could not help but call it an archive. Words fail. Yeah.
I mean, I think what I'm interested in also, for as long as you've known, I think, I first met Theaster in 2008, and he had only had the slide collection, I think, at that point. That was like maybe the first collection of the collections. But, and maybe Jessa, you can speak a little bit to this too. Like, what he's been quite opportunistic, with things like the stores going out of business. Also it grows out of passion. Like you have to who's not passionate about Frankie Knuckles? Like that's an important. Right. But like what's evolved over 15 years is like a sense of responsibility. I think for specific people like Frankie Knuckles or Robert Byrd or things that have now been entrusted to him, like the Johnson Archive, like. For Jessica, for somebody like you who works at an institution who has a quite thoughtful and like kind of reflexive relationship around collecting and the responsibilities of collecting, like, how has your engagement with Theaster's work maybe affected how you think about, how museums can think about some of these things?
Hi, Theaster. You know, I feel like as I'm listening to your responses, I have such fond memories of my introduction to Theaster, which was actually simultaneous with my introduction to art history as a discipline. Studying in Chicago, or in Evanston to be particular, because I know we have some Chicagoans here. But, you know, I remember going to JPC before, you know, before everything was decommissioned and sold, seeing the art collection, bopping around on the South Side, hearing rumblings of the activities that were happening, the dinners, the plate convergences that were happening in Hyde Park and whatnot. And, you know, Theaster, even though I didn't know him then, his work was central to what it meant to be an institution builder, and also a convener of people, ideas, objects. There was a lot of porosity between those kinds of categories. And I think experiencing now that I can call Theaster a friend and a collaborator, there is a commitment, as Hamza was saying, to finding value or utility in what one might think to be discarded. And I think what Theaster is successful at doing is translating that passion and that deep sense of knowing that I might not have a game plan for this object or this collection now, but best believe there's a plan for it that will emerge through my making, through my congregating. You know, most people know, you know, by now he's, you know, has a training. He's trained to be he was trained and worked for a long time as a city planner, and someone who has that sensibility to know how people and things and places and spaces work together or can work better together. I think also has that forward thinking or that sort of visionary sensibility, is to know that I need to pay attention to this, even when no one's looking at it. And I think that's something that we strive to do as institutional curators or curators at collecting institutions. It's not just our responsibility to show what's contemporary or what's in the moment. It's also our responsibility to think about the collectivity of those artists and their communities that they're adjacent to and who they're paying attention to. And that's something that Theaster has always done quite beautifully, I think.
Yeah. I mean, you could say that the ultimate collection within the collection of collections are the buildings, right? So it's the same thing in terms of looking at buildings. I mean, I was there, you know, we lived together, and I guess it would be 2008, because that was before you and Francesco came to do the studio visit, and we did a mock studio visit to get ready for you guys coming. You know, this is his first. He never had a studio. I wait, no, yeah, I guess he'd had studio visits before, but not one with those kinds of stakes on it. So I think Chiara Minchio is an artist. She was doing a residency in Chicago, and she's Italian, so she was Francesco, and I was you. So that was the breakdown. And but in 2008, as early as 2008, I mean, I remember when he bought the house next door. 6918 was the old candy store that he kind of tricked out. And then he bought 6916 with a loan from his former boss who worked at the CTA. And I remember hearing him on the phone because it was the real estate crash. And so he paid cash for that house. And he didn't, I mean, we lived together at that point. I just separated from my wife, and it was Theaster's Home for Wayward Men. And I think I was the first boarder, and then two other cats came in.
I remember like looking like, am I going to see Hamza sleep on a couch somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, you very well may have at that moment. But the way that he spoke about the bank, he has started speaking about the bank as early as when I was there, in the same way that he was saying, "Oh man, I want all the records from Dr. Wax." I was like, "Yes, what are you gonna do with this stuff, man?" And he said, "I'm gonna get that bank," and he would just say that. Like in this bank, the wrecking ball was ready to knock the bank over. So he must have made some of his first, yeah. He made some of his first art sales, bigger art sales, after, in Miami. This would have been after the biennial. And he went down to City Hall, and this is really important about him as an artist that I don't think people understand. I mean, Rick Lowe would be, I don't think, Rick Lowe is, a senior figure, but Theaster is his own beast in a way. Yeah, even though he acknowledges Rick Lowe as the, trailblazing in some sense, but his role as in city planning. So when people wanted to say, "Oh, I do social practices," and you would say to them, it's like, "Well, what's the name of your city councilman?" And they would go, "Oh, I don't know the name of my city councilman." And it's like, well, shit. I mean, what do you want to do? The thing about Theaster is he knew the name of the city councilman. He knew the name of the alderman adjacent to his ward. He knew who to talk to in the city. So he took, Kavi Gupta went down to Miami, sold the shoe shine stands, and I can go on anecdotes about that. He took the money from that sale, if I'm remembering things right, went down to City Hall. He had to pay $60,000 to $70,000 in order for them to not demolish the bank. So there was, like you said, it's like there was no plan. And so this was just the money needed to have the discussion with the city about the bank. They were like, "We won't take you seriously, but this is how much it costs basically for us to call off the wrecking ball." And he went down and said, "Okay, I'll put the money down." Now, that was no guarantees on anything at all, but it just displayed a kind of passion and commitment to something with no end goal necessarily. But he kept just talking about it, and I was like, "Man, what are you gonna do with this thing? What are you gonna do with this thing? This is a turn albatross,
Well, I think that's a good. I mean, why I was happy to have all three of you on the panel, because all of you have spent kind of extensive time, with Theaster in those spaces, and it's like kind of one of the things that you can't really translate into an exhibition anywhere. It's not just the social practice, but it's also like, what the potential of having those building does to like the vision for the practice, whether that's collecting, like, or imagining what even a museum exhibition can be, the kinds of spaces it can speak to. And that's certainly changed, as he's gotten more success. And it's not really just about, when you try to tell somebody in New York that he has all these buildings, they're like, what is he, like Jeff Koons? Is there like 500 people working on like monumental sculptures? But it's not really about that at all. It's like a material that is going to transform in interesting ways. And,
you'd asked the question just when we were sitting down. You mentioned perhaps like the impact architecturally, perhaps in terms of his thinking, perhaps on the exhibition. And I don't think if it doesn't. That's very interesting. Even though he did the big brick installation at Gagosian, I don't think it translates. I don't think his engagement with buildings and city planning, even though he's well nigh familiar with layout, architecture, design, he's much more of a object and material than I would say, like, how those things play themselves out in space. Yes, as an artist, he's wholly aware of that, but he doesn't engage with the architecture, at in that way. It's more stuff.
Yeah.
Now, what's more?
Yes, I can have like all these Carnegie shelves. Yeah, like that's seeing the potential because you have the space to.
Right, the space to deal with it, to play with it. But it isn't. That's not how his engagement with the buildings doesn't play out spatially in terms of his gallery practice, in that way. What's more important is the kind of the perception of him as an artist that we would have in the absence of that. It's like, no. The work upstairs, it's like his practice with the South Side and the buildings gives context in some way to the object-based practice. Even though, like ceramics, those things can kind of, they do, and he's making paintings, those things stand on their own. But he would be an entirely different artist, I don't think, if he didn't have that as a backdrop for how we think about them, you know.
I just wanted to add on to this notion of that, you know, kind of in a way the fundament of his collecting impulse is the buildings, in a way, the real estate portfolio, if you want to put it that way. And I mean, we've all worked with him. We've all had conversations with him about exhibitions and, curatorial projects. And I think most of you are probably familiar with the scenario that you show up at his house or one studio. You sit down for about 10 minutes and he tells you to get in his car, and let's go drive around. And because of course there's always a new thing to show, and the new thing is always a building. It's always a house, right? I mean, I don't see him that often, so it's not like a weekly habit. He doesn't have to show something new, not a brick building every week, but still, I want to go down a somewhat cliched philosophical rabbit hole that has to do with ceramics and collecting and building and all that. As a ceramist, in ceramics has now been a very dominant presence in contemporary art for some time, 10, 15 years, maybe late 2000s. Certainly, Theaster was a very early proponent of kind of the return to respectability of this particular tradition, this craft. But of course,
ceramics is the new black. As he
would say, the new black.
Who said that?
Yeah. But of course, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, ceramics was completely inconceivable as a respectable contemporary art practice, right? And he's certainly been one of the artists who has completely changed the narrative around this particular form. And I've written at length in the past in other contexts about this, kind of the renewed enthusiasm for ceramics as an early stirring, in a way, for the return of certain attentiveness to thingness and object culture, right? Material culture and thingness, really, Dinglichkeit, as the Germans would put it in their philosophy seminars. And of course, if you're interested in thing theory, which actually has a solid grounding at the University of Chicago, Bill Brown, a scholar of English literature at the University of Chicago, is kind of the matador of thing theory, and he's someone who's also been important to Theaster in the past. There's this influential essay which he published in the mid-2000s. It was an introduction to an anthology of writings on material culture, thing theory, more even than object theory. And of course, those who are familiar with the literature will know that the single most important texts written in this historical canon is Heidegger's text from the early 50s, Das Ding, the thing. And Heidegger, in this text, which was based on a lecture he gave in 1949 at the Art Academy in Munich, not a philosophy department at the university, but at an art academy, it's very important to know that in the 40s and 50s, art, in a way, became the refuge of much of Heidegger's thought. So in this essay, he kind of kind of embarked on this etymological exercise of trying to kind of untangle the philosophical roots of the idea of the thing. And of course, this is now somewhat more broadly known, but the etymological root of thing is in an Old Norse word for assembly, gathering space, right? And in Norway still today, I think the parliament is called the Alting. Maybe there's a Norwegian in the room who can confirm or corroborate. And likewise, the parliament in Denmark has the word thing in its name, and the same is true of Iceland. So, kind of the etymology of thing is in the notion of assembly, and I've always been struck in a way by this kind of somewhat oblique, but nonetheless very poignant parallel in this idea of ceramics as an art of gathering. And the vessel, right? I mean, this is also kind of part of Theaster's language. More than half of the objects on the third floor are black vessels, and they are objects meant to gather things, right? To gather water, food, fluids. But of course, Theaster's practice, like the basic programmatic social impulse of Theaster's work is to gather, right? And this is also why he's so interested in buildings, because they allow the gathering and the assembly of people. And so there's kind of an interesting, other text to be written about the idea of the potter as pottery as a metaphor for assembly in a way, which is of course complicated by the notion that the potter is also someone who sits alone at the wheel, except in Ghost.
Well, I think Jessica, you also talk quite a bit about that notion of assembly, or like around his practice of ceramics, which gets back to the kind of like the legend of some of those early gatherings in Chicago. Like the collective intentions of Dorchester Industries, where he's working within the community and also to kind of produce something that feeds back into the community. I'm also interested like in maybe how you perceive like this is really the first time where ceramics are a big part of how his work is read in New York. I mean, obviously all of us have known that he's been passionate about it for quite a long time. Like, we're there and we see it, but that's not how he's read, outside of Chicago. In this case, that notion of assembly, he's foregrounding that quite a bit with these videos on either side, where you see this kind of performative activity happening in the studio. I mean, what do you make of this, kind of this almost like mythologizing that he's doing around this kind of debut of his ceramic practice to a New York audience? Like,
such a great question. I think that clay has always been Theaster's great love and passion, and it's always been there. It's always been the bread and butter, and I think part of his early mythology, arguably, was I think him wrestling with the with coming to terms with the fact that he is at heart a potter. And so he's building all of these apparatuses, or apparati, whatever the plural is there, but, around his practice in that early, in that moment of the early aughts. But, Theaster was a part of a collective before his time in Chicago. He started a collective in Seattle in a pottery studio. He studied ceramics in Cape Town. And so when he returns to Chicago and starts these plate convergence dinners, he is not only working with a mentor ceramicist to throw those the plateware for these dinners. He invents this mythology around Shoji Yamaguchi, who is this master ceramicist who comes to the United States, falls in love with a civil rights activist. They tragically die in a car accident, but they have a son. And for one of those early dinners, Theaster hired an actor to perform as the son of this, fictive couple. So he's building a mythology around the very objects that folks are eating off of and drinking out of, and the food that is served was made by his one of his sisters. So there's a narrative, those dinners become, I think, a really important anchoring point in who Theaster would evolve to be as this assembler, as this one who as a convener. And that practice of convening, it still exists, today. In thinking about, I want to return to the question of the buildings, because it wasn't until working on a project with Theaster recently that I started to understand more about not just his entrepreneurial and his savviness when it comes to moving through infrastructure. But Theaster spent a lot of time in Mississippi. He talks about the logic of tending to his buildings in Chicago, like his time, learning from his uncle, tending to the land in Mississippi, waking up early, going to check on the cows, going to check on certain crops, going back, going from one space to another, one plot to another on the farm, and engaging in this process of like cultivating. And that labor, I think, is shot through in how we can then understand a Black chapel, which, every individual brick is connecting to some sort of external history. In the case of Black Chapel, Stokes-on-Trent, and this history of labor and factory work. And I live in Baltimore. I live in a mill town, and I see the imprint of all of those unidentified makers and laborers in the same way that I think Theaster is seeing the fundamental value of something like a brick or something like a vessel or something like a discarded ceramic shingle from Japan that is just sitting in stacks and stacks in his studio. Like there is a kind of, there's a deep acknowledgement that he's choreographing between labor and earth and people through his ceramic practice that I think is now starting to make sense. But maybe it's taken, 3 decades to get there.
Well, it's interesting, your description of his uncle actually sounds like the description of his father, because his father owned multiple properties. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, as much as that, there's the romantic, notion of the convener and the properties, then there's also, like you were saying, an entrepreneurial sense, because his father explicitly said to him, it's like, no, value is improper, it's in the land.
Yeah.
And so he owned multiple properties, and Theaster is one of 9 children, the only boy and the youngest. And he's the one who learns roofing. I don't think any of the sisters learn roofing. But I think in terms of working with his father mm-hmm. and going from property to property in terms of maintenance and a kind of upkeep was also a really, direct biographical, link towards wanting to acquire right. Property, because mm-hmm. Just that was what he was taught.
And there's a different activity in each of those properties, right? Like it is when you sort of look at it from a bird's eye view, you have this kind of conjuring that's happening in these different spaces, mm-hmm. And they're all interpolated. But I think when you only look at it from a social, a kind of like from the context of restoration or rescue or maybe even a kind of enterprising sensibility, you lose some of the ways in which that biography, that personal mythology, shows up in his practice.
Yeah, I think the best, if I were to try and construct a sense of where the acquisition of the property, is headed, or what does it culminate in, I guess, in a certain sense. I mean, there's, and it culminates in a variety of things, one of which would be the bank, right? The housing of archives and an art space. Another would be the St. Lawrence school, which is going to be the artist residency. But I think right now, probably the most, at least in some sense, outward-facing right now is the garden, which is quite amazing and very, very beautiful in terms of the plot. It's the way it's nestled in that neighborhood. So you really can't, it's not a park or garden. You have to live, a city no bigger than the reach of a single human voice or whatever. Like this park, you have to live somewhere in that radius of that to even know that that thing is there. And that's, I think, part of its beauty in a way. Mm-hmm. But I think of that as one of the in terms of the development or the evolution of his impulse to acquire property, and in terms of social practices, now obviously there's community gardens, so the idea of it actually, coming to that form, by his own route, let's say, is quite beautiful.
Jessica, I can't believe that bird's eye view you mentioned, the expression. I can't believe anyone has written an article about Robert Bird's eye view. I want to say something, I'm thinking about Robert Bird now, and the late scholar of Russian culture and literature in his library, and is something that I just kind of an anecdote that might be insightful or illuminating for the audience here, and this kind of the logic of acquisition and the serendipity also of acquisition. When Robert passed away in September 2020, age 50, which is my current age, his widow, Christina Kier, who is a professor at Northwestern, also of Slavic studies, Russian culture and Russian history. And in fact, very interestingly, Christina is the author of a book titled Imagine No Possessions, the constructivist object of Russian art. So she's actually also someone, who kind of looks at this from the scholarship really of object culture and material culture. Anyway, Christina's first wish was for Robert's library, consisting of 6,000 something books, half of which are in Russian. Her first wish was for the university to acquire this library. And in fact, some efforts were made to perhaps kind of maintain Robert's office on the university grounds at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park as a space that in the future could accommodate visiting fellows, people who could come to this office and make active use of the library. And there was some lobbying, some lobbying took place to convince the university in going down that route. But of course, a university, especially the University of Chicago, where I work, a Death Star of its own in a way. Thousands of professors, thousands of scholars, thousands of academics, all of whom die at some point. University libraries or university archiving systems do not have the capacity, of course, to accommodate all of these personal wishes of people who, have lost their loved ones and are looking for some way to publicly celebrate their achievement. The university had no interest whatsoever in this scenario. So it was actually through David Shutter, an artist friend of Theaster's, whose work is also in the exhibition, the two monochrome gray paintings. David Shutter, who had been very close to Robert in the last years of his life, the last months of his life, really. It actually is through David Shutter that Christina Kier found her way to Theaster. And, Theaster became, in some sense, an accidental recipient of this library. Of course, he knew Robert, and Robert had an interest. There was a strong converging interest that Theaster and Robert shared in the history of Black Marxism. Black radical traditions, and kind of the somewhat exotic and odd adventure of Black leftist politics in the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So there were many reasons, in a way, for that library to ultimately land in his hands. But it was, of course, also the serendipity driven by the callousness of an institution that does not, fundamentally care, of course, about personal stories, right? Personal histories. And, there's, and again, I kind of come back to what for me is a little bit the fundamental finding of this show, and how, personally, how deeply personal it is. And you mentioned that, clay is the bread and butter of, kind of the soul, in a way, of what he does. And it's interesting to be upstairs and see the Clay sermon film, which I hadn't seen before. I knew of it. And as I said, the first film I saw was the Black Monks' Amazing Grace gospel performance, which comes charged with kind of the usual invitation to somewhat kind of ironically look at religious fervor, but all of that irony is gone, in a way, in the Clay film, which is so incredibly direct in its expression of great love for the earth. And so the story of Theaster as an entrepreneur and an operator, and someone with absolutely phenomenal business savvy, really, is well known. But I'm also keen to kind of re-emphasize really kind of like the personal passion. Well, I think of course, we all know, and no need to kind of stress that, but, I felt called upon.
But I think that's even been like one of the most kind of striking things for us, even in working on this exhibition, is, as much as it, he's has a large vision for what, he can do in Chicago, but also what he could do institutionally. There's so much, obviously, like personal emotion that guides a lot of those decisions, and also a huge generosity, I think, in what stories he can tell through his work, whether that's somebody like Robert Byrd, who was not necessarily part of a narrative of his work, even 3 or 4 years ago, that's not really, but that is now like really the heartbeat of the exhibition. And I think that's, always what's surprising about Theaster is how open he is, to these serendipitous opportunities, but also like to, building meaningful relationships between people through the works he does and through the exhibitions that he puts together. So I think that's been a really special thing for us and for a lot of people who've seen the show so far. We have a lot of things we didn't talk about, like chapels and, and things like that, which we could get into. But I think we want to make some opportunities for people to ask questions. And maybe Austin, if you want to, if anybody has a question, you can. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk and for your time. I was wondering if we could return to the subject of death. I think that there's something really interesting or sort of tense about the idea of, let's say, using a form of music like gospel, where the oldest forms, or some of the oldest lyrics of gospel have kind of a sensuality towards death, like an intimacy towards, and almost a yearning or a longing. But at the same time, to collect what is almost dead, or to collect what is dying, is to sort of like forestall that moment of release. So I'm curious, like, what it means to have like an intimacy or a closeness with the dead, and at the same time to have a preserving kind of position of trying to forestall that action, which in a way was the position of, let's say, vernacular magic in the South, was to have both an intimacy towards death and at the same time to forestall it.
Oh, what a beautiful question. Yeah. And like observation of the kind of the alchemies at play in the work, and but also the connection to wider and longer histories that supersede a kind of art context. I think, your question recalls a moment a few months ago that I had in the studio alone, actually. And Theaster had staged the third floor, which all the ceramic works. And we had a conversation afterwards about my time in the space, but he had talked about creating those vessels as also a meditation, not just on the loss that he was experiencing at the time in the sort of insurmountable grief, but also in anticipation that he will also not be here one day. And what does it mean to pour oneself into a form that will ultimately last longer than one's body? And I think that gospel has that sort of sense of acknowledgement built into it, right? Like that this won't last forever. And there's a kind of moment of through celebration and also agony, moving through that and in anticipation that there will be some salvation or something redeemable about one's experience thereafter on the other end. And I think that's something that is happening, those kind of twinned effects of both release and redemption through that. To borrow your term, Dieter, morbidity is a dance that's happening all throughout the show. Even if we move away from a kind of sonic sensibility, there's a painting as you move from the third floor to the second floor, Black Jesus. And you see, I feel like Theaster is like the quintessential medieval modernist because he has this really, I don't know, there's just something kind of like really compelling and interesting about his interest in icons and the power that icons have, whether they be derived from kind of Christian origins or Western origins or sort of Black diasporic practices. Like he's interested in the visualizing that that moment of recognition that I was sharing earlier around, through the pain of or through sort of recognizing Jesus as icon also in that moment after resurrection and seeing the kind of the sort of vestiges of that sacrifice in real corporal terms. Like Theaster is really, I think, invested in unpacking the power that comes with bringing together like both icon and also the kind of forms of mourning and practices of mourning.
Yeah, it's a great question indeed, or a great remark generally, and there's something I want to add really about the sensuousness of death, which is something that you mentioned, and kind of the mirage of Black Jesus. And again, it's an anecdote which will perhaps sounds a little crass and flip, but it's too powerful to restrain in a way. So there's this beautiful sculpture on the third floor of the coat rack with the white rabbit fur coat that belonged to Theaster's father. The beauty of that piece is in the lighting, the shadow that it kind of casts on the wall is absolutely gorgeous, and actually it kind of reminded me a little bit of Joseph Beuys's felt suit, and of course Beuys is always there as the arch, the pope of social sculpture in a way, but more poignantly, when Theaster's father passed away, Theaster Senior passed away, at the venerable old age of, I think he was 88 or 89. I was invited, Theaster invited me to come to his funeral, and I did. And the funeral was held in a funeral parlor in, I think it was Austin, so on the west side of Chicago, which is where Theaster was actually born and grew up, and where his father lived all his life. Theaster's kind of artistic life is rooted in the south side, but his, the origin story really is on the west side, which is a very different part of town, much less visible, much less mythical also in the history of Black Chicago. And I went to this funeral service, and I don't go to church really, except to look at the art, and that will mostly then be in Italy or something. And I do not go to religious services really, and I have never been to, and I don't go to a Black church, and I don't go to a Black church service. And this for me was a completely novel experience. I had never been inside a space charged with that particular energy, and this funeral service was like utterly amazing, like totally electrifying. With many people speaking about Theaster Senior's life, and one of Theaster's brothers-in-law is a pastor who spoke incredibly passionately. And as I left this service, and out of a audience of maybe 300 or 400 people, I was one of 4 or 5 white people in the audience. And as I left, I told Theaster, and of course I didn't I certainly did not mean this to sound in any way crass, as I mentioned earlier, but I told him, like, this is the best funeral I've ever been to. Like, the greatest church service I'd ever been to. This of course because utterly foreign to me, but it was of course a celebration of life as much as death. We all know that. But there was a real sense in that moment of joy, and like a certain kind of a sensuous energy, and morbid is then not the word that you want in a way, because morbid feels like kind of morbid is the stuck up northern Protestant restrained in a way. I mean, this was a very different experience, and those, like, to have in a way the privilege of kind of witnessing these particular events kind of is incredibly instructive, and it is of course seeing Black Jesus in that niche, like when I one more anecdote, and I don't want to drag on forever, this is the last thing I'll say actually. But the last thing, so I moved to Chicago in 2012 to work at the MCA. And the last exhibition that I curated there was the big Kerry James Marshall survey show, Mastery, which traveled from the MCA to the Met here, to Breuer, then went to LA MoCA. And and it's a show that many people have seen, important show for Kerry certainly, and certainly for me as well. And the day before the opening, Kerry and I did a tour of the show together. He had left the curating of the exhibition, the hanging of the exhibition, mostly in the hands of myself, Helen Molesworth, and a third curatorial colleague, Ian Aldeveer. And as we were walking around the exhibition, I realized that actually the only picture in the show of a white person was the decapitated head of Nat Turner. And in a way, like, I'm John Brown. Yes, exactly. Yes. No, Nat Turner was the rebel, right? Yes, John Brown's head. John Brown's head. I don't know the history. And so I and yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to say something about my own relationship with the question of Blackness in that particular kind of program, in that project, which is something that I also have to negotiate, right?
we have any more questions?
Thank you. I was wondering if, just turning quickly back to like pottery and clay, if the significance of Dave the Potter, it's kind of, alluded to it a few times in the show, and Gates did a lot in earlier exhibitions, but just wondering if we could discuss the significance to Gates's practice of Dave the Potter.
Oh, huge. I mean, huge. It's always been, it was Theaster turned me on to Dave, back when we first met back in 2006, 7, 8, 9, 8, maybe, as a real guiding, and it's funny, I guess he described himself at the time as a confused potter performer. I think is how he described himself, as opposed to painter poet. He was also a slam poet, and I think that's the book, the shelf, the book with the on spines, and Chicago was the home, the point for slam poetry, and so Theaster was no stranger to the slam poetry circuit when he had dreads. But Dave's verse, and he did a very early show in Milwaukee that incorporated, and I can't think of the name of the collection. It's a very prominent collection of American art, early American art, I believe, and folk art. And it is, they have a relationship. It's a private collection, but it has a very, a relationship with the Milwaukee Art Museum, which displays a very large portion of this collection. And they have Dave's, a hymnal for Dave, I think was the name of that show that he did, just to speak to how direct he is in referencing that. But I know that there, upstairs you have the video of the sermon in the pottery studio. But I've seen, in Theaster has done, in part earnest, in part tongue-in-cheek, in terms of throwing at the wheel and, singing, putting Dave's verse to song, which I think is quite beautiful. But yeah, so it's really, really a key touchstone for him as an artist. You couldn't overstate it.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to. I think there's a kind of expansiveness about how he thinks about clay that I think is underappreciated. I think it's not just Dave the Potter, but you have that beautiful Louis Sullivan cross on the third floor, which speaks to another history of the material within Chicago. You have the work of Marva Jolly, who's another absolutely brilliant figure who Theaster had a personal relationship, somebody that he knew quite closely, and that's again a network and a tradition of pottery that's is I think it's personal and it's intuitive, but it's also expansive in a way that you don't get once it starts entering institutions. It's like I said before, it's amazing that Met show is happening, but I think I learned so much more about pottery from Theaster than I do from ceramics or about clay in general than I do from whatever my my wonderful colleagues at other institutions, the stories they tell with that material, the same material. So I think it's really, I'm so happy that pot's in the show, because I think it represents a lot of what Theaster's work can mean in this kind of expanded way. So I think maybe that's about all the time we have tonight. But thank you so much, Dieter and Jessica and Hamza, and also Theaster, even though he isn't here, we thank you in absentia for the beautiful show that you made for us. And thanks for being here tonight. And please come back and see us. There's 2 more weeks of the show, and there's some great performance that will be happening during the show. And yeah, there's still lots to see and learn. So, thanks.